I would like to welcome everybody again to this Zoom panel on Black women's biography. I'm Carla Kaplan, and I will frame the conversation and moderate. We are going to save time in our hour for questions because I have a feeling the audience will have a lot of them. Please put them in the chat, and I will do my best to monitor the chat and call on people and get to as many questions as possible. I would just like to start by thanking Linda Lovell, who's here, and the entire staff of Bio for facilitating this panel and for making this conference happen, even though we couldn't all be together. And I just want to say, I really hope we're all together a year from now and that I get to see everybody's faces. I want to thank the panelists for participating, and I'm going to get started because we just have an hour today. So just some framing remarks to get us started. Black women's biographies have been essential to creating a tradition, rounding out the historical record, revealing which lives matter and to whom, and to creating a new history in which we can understand and appreciate the role Black women have played as rebels and resistors, mothers and daughters, CEOs and scientists, mathematicians and inventors, activists and writers, artists and teachers. Black women's biographies have also reshaped in fundamental ways what we think a life story is and what it means to tell that story. Recent years have seen what some have been calling an explosion of Black women's biographies across different fields, many of them highly innovative in form and structure, contributing significantly to our rethinking of what a life story can and should be, and reshaping what it means to imagine lost histories, especially in the absence of their evidence. Some of us just came from the archive panel where we've been talking about what is and isn't available to researchers. To some of us, this seeming explosion feels more like a necessary correction. And indeed, we'd like to see much more of an explosion. We'd like to see many, many, many more books in Black women's biography. But it is also true that we now have biographies of Harriet Jacobs, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Lorraine Hansberry, Lucy Terry Prince, Nella Larsen, Florence Kennedy, Polly Murray, Billie Holiday, Sally Hemings, Aretha Franklin, Josephine Baker, Venus and Serena Williams, Amy Jacques Garvey, Pauline Hopkins, Constance Baker Motley, Zora Neale Hurston, and many others, including many now in the works, including Merzey Tate, Octavia Butler, and many others. So we do have a wealth of biographies we didn't have, even in many cases 5 years ago. And yet, as these biographies hit the market, the genre continues to face very particular challenges. Issues of voice and publicness that are particular to Black women's history, to what Christina Sharp calls the ongoing wake of slavery and the Middle Passage for Black women and their lives. That wake shapes our approach to history, to past lives, to what a life looks like, to the politics and aesthetics of telling life stories, and especially to how we understand issues of voice and of absence in the histories of Black women's lives. Numerous Black feminist critics, such as Farah Jasmine Griffin, have argued that Black women face particularly strong pressures to guard their public voices. They may mask or dissemble, they may stay silent or rage, but they may rage only to trusted interlocutors. And so Black women's archives may deliberately be constrained or truncated, and at the same time, they may be externally constrained. Compounded by the institutional effects of systemic racism, Black women's archives can remain attenuated. And in many cases, they simply don't exist. They have to be imagined or pieced together from scraps, as Saidiya Hartman, Carla Peterson, and others have so eloquently theorized. They may not be indexed. They may be hard to access. Often they are not well funded or maintained. And so the project of opening those archives, creating archives, reading between the lines and the absences in the archives that we do have has been fundamental to the restorative and recuperative work of Black women's biography and has given Black women's biography its very particular shape. Some Black women's biographies have started only with a quilt, attributed to a once anonymous quilter whose life is now known and detailed. Here, I think of Harriet Powers, unnamed at the heart of Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, but now known to us in surprising and really wonderful detail. Some stories have started with a photograph or a painting, sometimes iconic, and I think here of that image of Dorothy Pitman Hughes, her fist raised next to Gloria Steinem, but unidentified for decades by most scholars, her story all too often neglected and untold when Steinem's was told over and over and over again. Or we think of the famous photo of Mary Mildred Williams used by abolitionists across the country, even as her own story was buried. Some stories like Anna Tubbs's Three Mothers or Margot Shetterly's Hidden Figures or Annette Gordon Reed's begin with everything that is missing and still going unsaid. Some about family members whose records were not archived and might not have originally been considered significant, but whose stories, as all three of today's panelists have shown us, we so very desperately need. Some biographies have been researched and written by people we might consider outsiders, and that has created its own difficult conversation. I think of the long history of Black feminist critiques of Henrietta Lacks, of Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and how little effect that critique has had on the phenomenal success of that book. In other words, we have an urgent need for stories that meets an absence of records and a particular set of factors that may seem to slam doors shut, even as some are blown open. And those pressures have created startling new innovations and opportunities. Most obvious are books that have recreated the genre entirely, like Ty Miles' phenomenal All That She Carried, or Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives. This panel includes three diverse biographers of Black women's lives who have confronted and resolved all of these issues and who can help us guide through the challenges and ways to address them. Let me introduce each of them, and I'll ask them then to speak for 5 or 6 minutes in the order in which I will introduce them, and then I will ask a couple questions, and then we will open to yours. Ashley D. Farmer is an associate professor in the departments of History and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, the author of the phenomenal Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous venues, including the Black Scholar and the Journal of African American History. Her research has also been featured in many popular outlets, including Vibe, NPR, the Chronicle Review, the Washington Post. And Ashley is currently at work on Queen Mother Audley Moore, Mother of Black Nationalism, the first full-length biography of Moore, someone whose career spans nearly 70 years. Lelia Bundles is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother, a book that was, I think the way she puts it, is the inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. And Ms. Bundles is currently at work on The Joy Goddess of Harlem, Elia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, about her great-grandmother, whose parties, patronage, and international travels helped define and shape that era. She is a former network television executive and producer at ABC News and NBC News, on the advisory board of the Schlesinger Library, on the history of women in America at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, and founder of the Madam Walker Family Archive. So she's also founded an archive. And Saika Diggs-Colbert is the it's Idle, right? Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts at Georgetown University. She has held fellowships from the NEH, the Woodrow Wilson, Stanford, the Mellon Foundation, and the Woodruff Library. She is an associate director at the Shakespeare Theater Company and the author of the remarkable book, Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry. Also Black Movements and the African American Theatrical Body. She has served as creative content producer for the Public Theater's audio play Shadowland, and her interests span the 19th to the 21st century, from Harriet Tubman to Beyonce, from poetics to performance. So in that order, I would like to thank my panelists again and invite them to each speak for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we will address some questions to them.
Great, thank you. And thank everybody for being here on a Friday afternoon, and sorry for being late. Zoom loves to update right when you have something important to do, always. It's like it knows. Anyway, as Carla said, I am writing a history of Queen Mother Audley Moore, who lived from 1898 to 1997. It isn't a slice of life, but rather kind of the first complete biography of her life. And Moore is a really interesting figure. She lived a life. If you study Marcus Garvey's UNIA, you'll find her as a dues-paying member 50 years after the organization is done. If you look at the Communist Party, you'll see her on street corners and at the ballot box as a member and a promoter of Black women's issues there. If you study Black nationalism or the civil rights movement, you'll find her writing telegrams from everybody from King to JFK, to mentoring Malcolm X, to talking to Louis Farrakhan. And if you study the global Black freedom struggle, you'll find her meeting everybody from dictator Idi Amin to Julius Nyerere. So she really is somebody whose life expanded and really cultivated what we might think of as the radical Black freedom movement from the 1920s all the way to her last public appearance at the Million Man March in 1995. I like to often say, if Rosa Parks midwifed the civil rights movement, then really Audley Moore midwifed Black nationalism as we know it today. But interestingly enough, there's very little secondary literature on her whatsoever, and no complete biography or any kind of chapters really or anything about her, even though she is kind of everywhere all at once. And it's that really got me interested in writing about her. As I was writing my first book, Remaking Black Power, everybody that I talked to had said what a formative role she had played in their thinking. Every archive that I went to, there was some mention of Queen Mother getting up and making a scene no matter where she was. I kind of like to think of her in some ways as the spider web that holds the 20th century Black freedom movement together. And I think this analogy is apt because you often only see her literally if you run into her at the archive, as it were, or also if the light kind of shines on her just right, the archival light shines on her just right. So I think she's a really interesting figure, and one that really shows us this breadth and depth of the Black freedom movement and offers us an alternative to kind of the mainstream civil rights organizing that some of us are most familiar with. But this project has been fraught with challenges. Because she had a 3rd grade education, she often was a street corner speaker. She has no archive, as it were. And what doesn't mean because she wasn't a prolific collector of things herself, but there's questions of where this alleged archive is. It's kind of like a little bit of a national treasure hunt. Some people say it's in Mount Addis Ababa, an ode to the only free Black nation in Africa. Some say that it's in her hometown of New Iberia, Louisiana. I've been there, it doesn't seem to be there. I've even been giving talks about Queen Mother Moore and had people stand up and swear that they are wearing her old outfits, her old headdresses, her old bangles, and said that they've been given to her. So perhaps the archive is spread that way. So the way I like to kind of think of Moore's archive is not necessarily one of absence, but whether the one that is kind of what I call disorderly distributed, meaning that it is scattered in all kinds of places, literally all over the world. And it kind of makes for a discordant story because it's not neatly categorized, put into a finding aid, and one cannot flip pages from one page to the other and make a decent accounting of her life. But the problem with that is that this kind of discordance of our archive, or this disorderly distribution of its archive, has come to stand in for the idea of Moore herself. It's kind of made her seem as though she is disorganized, that her ideas and ideologies are not coherent, and therefore she's not been worthy of a biographical treatment in the way that we do many of her counterparts. So that's been one challenge of writing this that I think we could probably talk about, when the archive is not necessarily lacking, but not ordered in a way that makes it easy to find. The second real challenge of Moore is, proving that she's worthy of a biography. Like I said, there isn't this great, she isn't a great leader of a singular organization, but rather the creator and leader of many. She isn't, someone who has written a lot in terms of what we would think of a major thinker, but there is nobody small or large that looms in the movement that hasn't been under her ideological influence, right? So we still have this kind of issue of not being able to fully assess why Black women, if we can't put them in one of the categories of kind of leader, thinker, sidekick in a really clear way, deserve this kind of biographical treatment. Luckily, as Carla said, there are tons of great books that have come out that kind of help us think about this. I think Saidiya Hartman, Taya Miles are great examples. Even Nell Irving Painter's early biographies of Sojourner Truth offer a really great ways to think about this archivally. I think Ransby's Ella Baker offers a great way to think about not only a life, but also an organizing manual at the same time, which also a person like Moore provides for us. So I think it's a really exciting time to write a biography of someone like Moore, even if there are challenges. And I really look forward to talking a little bit more about how we might navigate these things and promote biographies of the kind of those that hold the web together, as it were, that are also Black women.
Thank you, Ashley.
So should I just jump right in?
That would be great. Thank you.
All right, great. Okay, well, thank you, Carla and Ashley. That was fascinating. And yes, this explosion is a necessary correction. So I'm really glad that we're having a chance to have this conversation today. And I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that Carla posed to us when we were planning this. And so I'll start with how I came to write about Madam C.J. Walker and Elia Walker. So that's my great-great-grandmother and my great-grandmother. When I was growing up in Indianapolis, my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. So I would go with her to her office and see the ladies in the factory who were mixing up the products. The silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. The baby grand piano on which I learned to read music had belonged to Elia Walker, was in her apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. But my interest was becoming a journalist rather than going into the family business. And fortunately, my parents thought that I should do what my passion was. In high school in the late 1960s, I was much more interested in Elia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance because I was discovering Black writers and she had known those people. And we happened to have some of the first editions by Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and Jean Toomer on our bookshelf. So I wrote a paper about her during my senior year in high school. But this wasn't an all-consuming interest for me. When I got to Columbia for journalism school, Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty, recognized my unusually spelled name, realized that I had a connection to Madam Walker and Elia Walker. And even after I gave her some very cliched topics, she looked at me and she said, no, you're going to write about your family. That's what you're going to write about. And that really put me on a journey in the fall of 1975 that's led to 4 books and really trying to expand who Madam Walker was in the public mind, that it wasn't just her hair care products, though she was a pioneer of the modern hair care industry, but also a philanthropist, a political activist, an entrepreneur who provided jobs and economic independence for thousands of Black women. But after Columbia, I had a detour to a 30-year network television news career, but always on the side, I was doing research and writing. Carla, you asked us about some of our early sources and inspiration. So clearly there were roadblocks. There were very few books being published by or about Black women in the mid-1970s when I began my research. And I'm always clear to say published because I know people were writing things, they just weren't being published. But yeah, this was an era when Toni Morrison would have a book and maybe 6 months later, Alice Walker would have a book, and I still had my Nikki Giovanni books of poetry from college, but not a lot was being published. And there was certainly no biography of Madam Walker until I wrote my young adult book about her in 1991. I was turned down for an NEH grant, and when I FOIA'd the documents, one of the evaluators said that my topic on Madam Walker was not important enough for a grant, so there was that. But I also did have lots of encouragement. Especially from women who were members of the Association of Black Women Historians, from people like Beverly Guy Sheftall, who edited Sage, the women's journal quarterly at Spelman College, from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. There were safe harbors for me to go talk about my research. And there were books that I was hungry for, these books that would sort of come out every now and then. Carol Ione's Pride of Family, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's Balm in Gilead about her mother and grandmother, Gail Buckley Lumet's biography about the Horn family, Nell Painter's Exodusters. And I see that David Levering Lewis is on. So when his Du Bois biographies came out, I ate them up because this was a serious scholar delving into a life that needed to be discussed. And it was really, I think, up to some of us who had family ties to write about these people and to tell these stories that the publishing industry had ignored. I also was mentored by Alex Haley, who was interested in writing a book about Madam Walker. I did the research for that book. Alex never finished it, but I think he was put into my life to sort of help put me on the path. You also asked about original documents. And while Ashley is having to piece together really shards of things, I almost have too much information. We're really fortunate that between my family and the employees of the Walker Company, we have tens of thousands of documents, many of which have now been digitized. And then, of course, there are other people's papers and newspapers that mention Madam Walker and Elia Walker. So I really, again, have too much material. One of the questions that I often get is, family members writing biography. And I think that, maybe because I'm writing about people who were dead long before I was born, I don't have some of those same protective notions that some people have if they were writing about parents. But I am fortunate that one of my last conversations with my mother before she died in 1976, when I was just starting to do this. And I said, I'm finding some things that, Madam Walker's not perfect. What do I do? And she, in her hospital bed, said to me, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. So I've always felt that as a journalist and as a person who's grounded in history, that I'm trying to tell the truth and to make sure that the full story is out there. I know that many people are, sort of fascinated by the critical fabulation movement. But I would also suggest that needs some critique as well, because the desire to fill in the blanks that we often confront when we're writing about Black women can actually do some harm. And I have seen this happen in books where a writer is using secondary sources, not using the primary sources when the material is actually there. And so it just sometimes compounds some myths. So that's a concern for me. And then there's the Netflix series, which we can talk about during the Q&A. But I would just say that part of my goal for the biography I'm working on now about Elia Walker is to move her beyond the caricature that has been repeated in many Harlem Renaissance biographies and histories, to give her more dimensions so that she gets beyond the trope of Madam Walker made the money, Elia Walker spent the money, she had a lot of parties, the end. And as a journalist who writes about members of my family, I'm not trying to sanitize, I'm really trying to correct myths and misinformation and to add more depth and dimension, and to use my particular vantage point and access to materials that others might not have. So you ask us also about how our projects fit into the larger telling of Black women's lives. And I think with On Her Own Ground, I was trying to reframe Madam Walker's life and also to incorporate the lives of Black women from the Civil War era through World War I. And with Elia Walker's life, I'm trying to expand the notion of who she was as a person, someone who loved the arts, who really did support the arts as a patron of the arts, and who was in a unique position as a Black heiress to have parties that brought people together who otherwise would not have been in the same room. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elia. Sayika?
Thank you so much. Thank you to my co-panelists for your brilliant reflections, and to Carla for gathering us together for this conversation. I've already learned so much, and I'm excited to just speak for a little while about my biography, Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry. And hopefully if there's time, I'll be able to talk some about the work that I'm currently doing. And so my first book is on African-American theater, and any scholar of African-American theater cannot avoid, nor should they want to avoid, Lorraine Hansberry. There have been many playwrights that have written with concern about how large a shadow that she cast, but I was first introduced to Hansberry in my research around African-American theater. And so one of the curiosities that emerged in that work was that Hansberry was so well known as a one-hit wonder, as the author of Raisin in the Sun, although she had written and published and had other plays produced while she was alive. And so that was really the impetus for me to begin research on a radical vision. And what I found during my time at the Schomburg Center, which is where Hansberry's papers are archived, is that not only was she a prolific writer of plays, poems, essays, she drafted a novel, but that she was also writing for more than a decade before, or up to a decade before A Raisin in the Sun was produced. And one of the things that's curious to me about how she's remembered is that although all of that writing is in the public domain, when people talked about her in periodicals after A Raisin in the Sun, they often only focused on this one play and ignored all of the writing she was doing in leftist periodicals in the 1950s leading up to the publication of the play. And so one of the things that I try to establish in my biography is that Hansberry was multifaceted, that she was an activist, an artist, a spokeswoman, and an intellectual, and that all of those aspects of her are readily available. And so to ask the question as to why we just focus not only on her as a playwright, but her as the author of this one play. And so I begin the book by looking at a speech that Hansberry gave in 1962 in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it establishes Hansberry's views about the nature of history and how she understood the ongoing necessity of understanding the Black freedom movement, as Ashley mentioned, as a global fight for freedom, and that the intersection of the civil rights movement with the Cold War was a way for her to reflect on that intersection. And so after looking at Hansberry's speech, I then take up her most well-known play, A Raisin in the Sun, and look at the context that really shaped her vision for the play. And so as many people know, I describe Hansberry as a movement baby in the book. She was the daughter of two activists. Her father, Carl Augustus Hansberry, was born in 1895, just 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. He migrated with her mother to Chicago. That's where they met. And they formed a power couple. And one of the things that's really fascinating about Hansberry's mother and her father is that they offer different models for civil rights activism that really informed her work moving forward. And so her father is well known for the case Hansberry v. Lee, which sought to desegregate housing in Chicago. And he filed the case in response to a restrictive housing covenant that was being used to try to bar him from integrating a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. What's important, I think, about that moment in Hansberry's life is that while her father was off fighting for justice in Washington, D.C., her mother was guarding their home with a firearm. And so Hansberry got to see both her father fighting in the courts, as well as a lesson about self-defense that would inform how she approached civil rights activism when she moved to New York in 1950 and began her career as a writer. And so not only did Hansberry have the influence of her parents as models of civil rights activism, but she also had close family friends, N.W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, a generation of activists that were involved in the Popular Front and gave Hansberry an understanding of the basis for art and activism as rooted in labor politics. And so although, we often think about the civil rights movement period as being the classical phase, I should say, of the civil rights movement period, as sometimes being distanced from the Cold War efforts because of the ways that the Red Scare was driving activists underground, including Hansberry's mentor, Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. Hansberry was very much clear about those intersections in all of her work. And so again, to me, it was fascinating the way that that part of her life and story has been absented from a lot of conversation about her. The other thing that I'll say is that in terms of thinking about how to understand her multiplicity, one of the early challenges that I faced as a writer is really thinking about an archive that had been primarily cultivated by Hansberry's then ex-husband. And so as I was writing the book, I really had to think about what it meant that, one, Hansberry left her papers to her ex-husband, and then two, that he had been the primary curator of the archive, which was then passed to his second wife, and now is being managed by his stepdaughter. And so part of my work in figuring out how to navigate the archive, I leaned on many of the scholars that have already been mentioned, Farrah Griffin, Sadia Hartman. For my work, Daphne Brooks's analysis of archival material, particularly in arts, has been really instructive. Barbara Ransby's biography of Ella Baker has been really helpful in thinking about Hansberry's activism. But all of the aforementioned authors think about gaps in the archive, particularly as they pertain to Black women and how we might navigate them. But I also thought a lot in my book about the curation of an archive, what was left out. Even now, as I'm sure many people know, there's certain parts of Hansberry's archive that you can only view via special permission. And so again, I was really curious about thinking about those restrictions, what was allowed, what was disallowed. But I'll just end my comments by saying, and working with the trust, ultimately, they were very supportive of my work, and they gave me access to and allowed me to write about all of the aspects of her archive that I requested. And so I'm grateful because as I'm endeavoring on my new work, some of it can be a little bit more challenging than that. And so I'm grateful that I had a chance to work with the Hansberry Trust, and they were very, very generous in giving me access and allowing me to publish about work that has yet to be published and that many scholars don't even know exists as a part of Hansberry's archive. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all three of you again for sharing that and giving people a sense of what you were setting out to do, what you had to work with, how you had to work around what you did or you didn't have. I'm going to give people a chance to put their questions in the chat, and I'll ask the first question to give the rest of you a chance. If you would put your questions in the chat, that would help me establish an order for questions and get to them. And in the meantime, let me ask the three of you, and again, in the order that you spoke would be great. I'm going to combine a question that's both about methods and about craft. Certain methods have become kind of de rigueur in biography. Everybody talks about them. You hear certain kinds of methodological, almost mottos come up at the conference year after year. For example, Robert Caro's dictum, turn every page, right? That has become almost a kind of methodological primer for biographers. Well, how do you turn every page if you don't have an archive, as Ashley said, from which to turn every page? Other kinds of issues that come up as issues of method or craft and that may not pertain to your subjects or the work you're doing. One hears over and over again the importance for biographers in maintaining a kind of critical distance from their subjects. Well, really, in the case of Black women's biography, do we want to tell Black feminist biographers to maintain a critical distance from subjects who too often have been denigrated, criticized, ignored, or neglected? I think about the life of somebody like Moore or Walker, or aspects like the sexuality or the left politics of somebody like Hansberry. Do we want to then reiterate some of those constraints and histories by suggesting as a methodological issue that their biographers should maintain critical distance or objectivity? I'm not so sure about that. Some of the other kinds of methodological or craft issues we hear over and over again is the notion that we should be using newspapers, we should be placing our subjects in context, particularly placing our subjects in the history of their society and their culture as exemplary figures through whom we can tell the story of the culture at their time. Well, really, in the case of Black women who may have been treated as anything but exemplary of the history of that time, does that work methodologically? Does that work as a kind of craft response to the way in which we're going to construct their stories? So I guess what I'm asking is, do the normal suggestions for method, do the normal suggestions for craft, do they in fact fit the subjects of Black women's biography? And do we need a different set of protocols emanating from a subject matter that has met a very particular history? So that's my very broad question, asked to give people a chance to put their questions in the chat. And why don't we start, Ashley, with you, if we could?
Oh man, that's a lot to ask. I do think that we have to, as Black women biographers, exist somewhere in between the turn every page and the critical fabulation. I share two concerns, as beautiful as it is, with that standing in for a rigorous effort to find or unlock actual archives that exist. So I think that there are these polls for us that have often been guiding our work, biography and otherwise. And I do think that one of the things that this new strain of biographies can do is perhaps find kind of a middle ground or a way forward that allows us to address for some of these issues. But I can think of very few Black women who could have such an archive as to be able to turn every page. So it's never been one that's been easy for us. But I do think, or I am wary of us falling in the trap that there's nothing, because I do think that that's more of a product of the way in which we organize and theorize the archive than it is a question of source material, right? That also gets into a bigger issue of just Black history in general as to what qualifies as a source and what qualifies as material, which we have to think about and have always thought about differently than most people. To the question of objectivity, I mean, that's something never afforded to any Black woman in life, so I'm not sure how it would be afforded to their biographer of their life. And so I wouldn't even begin to pretend that that anybody is thoughtfully engaging in that. And I think it's often something that only certain kinds of writers are allowed to hide behind in order to prop up their work. And it's a way to lower the basis of those of us who do a work that doesn't fit into the mainstream. It's just my personal opinion about it. And so I make no qualms about closeness to a subject or a personal imperative as to why I believe that Moore's work should be known or to why I think her story is valuable. But I see that as, if not an objective, a corrective, right, to hundreds of years of history where she herself was told that she was not worthy. And by not writing her down, the history books were repeating the same. There's even a story that I've heard that Moore at one point had, I mean, I have pictures of Moore with voluminous amounts of material that is either scattered or no longer exist. And like I said, questions abound as to where it went. And she offered it to archives, so the stories go. But even in her lifetime, there were real questions about the value of that. And now, you know, that seems like a very different story. So I just think it's really important for us to try to bring back that archive as much as possible through our work as we can. So I think I'll stop with those two things for now to give other folks a chance.
So Ashley, yes, everything that Ashley said. The turning the page, though, I mean, I do think that they're having started doing this research like almost 50 years ago, you know, and doing it now, it's really different. It was, if I wanted to see the Chicago Defender, I had to go to Chicago to go through microfilm. Mm-hmm. You know, if I wanted to see the New York Age, I had to come to the Schomburg to go through the materials. But it's so different now. In addition to, I know I am very fortunate to have these tens of thousands of pages. That makes a huge difference. But, you know, it's newspapers.com and ProQuest and Genealogy Bank that I find so many tidbits. I just, you know, the chapter I'm writing right now for the Elia Walker biography is the founding of the Dark Tower, the iconic Dark Tower. And I've been able to pull together, I mean, it's literally thousands of sources to try to recreate what was happening in the meeting where Countee and Aaron Douglas wasn't there, but Countee and Langston and others were in this meeting. And there are pieces that I can put together, but I think it is, sometimes you go down a rabbit hole, but I think that it's richer if you really do try to exhaust as many of the primary sources and the newspaper articles and random letters and interviews as you can. And for me, it's really important to get as much information as you can. And when I make some kind of speculation, I really want to make sure that I am having every possible fact that I can when I do that. And as in terms of the critical distance, I just think that so many of the people that we're talking about today and that we're writing about have basically been caricatured or put into a box. And it's really important for us to figure out what were those lenses with which they were being examined, what sexism was there, what classism was there, what assumptions were being made. And so again, when I'm writing about Elia Walker, I know that the same paragraph about her is repeated over and over again. And it is basically, she had parties, she had an attention span of 6 minutes, she didn't read books, she didn't really contribute she really wasn't a patron of the arts. And well, that's many years of research. None of those things is true, but that gets repeated over and over again and people take it as fact. And so it's been important to me to think, well, either what information do people have when they were writing those things, or what was the lens with which they were evaluating her?
Thank you. That was so helpful. Sayika?
So I agree with everything my colleagues have said. The only thing that I would add is that because I have been doing life writing that is at the intersection of cultural studies, one of the questions that I asked, and Ashley brought this point up, but I'll just offer a specific context within my own work. One of the questions that is always asked is how the artwork how it functions as evidence as a part of the life writing, and how we might understand the creation of art as a part of that story. And so, one of the things that's fascinating in thinking about Hansberry's life in particular and other artists' life is really examining how they are narrating and translating events that happen to them as they're creating their own works. And so one of the ways I tried to theorize that practice is to think about the idea of practice and Hansberry's writing as a way of her cultivating herself as an artist and as an activist. And so in that way, it is in the tradition of literary biography, but also in thinking about how to make sense of different types of evidence. And certainly Black women's biographies call for us to think about evidence, I would argue, in a more capacious sense, because of the different locations where their work might be found or information about their lives might be found. And also, again, how we make sense of it. And so I do think that, something that Daphne Brooks's work has taught me, although she's writing about the 19th century, I think it still adheres to the figures that I primarily write about in the 20th century, is that the perspective of newspaper journalists during the period 1950s, for example, who are writing about Hansberry has to be understood within the context of race and gender. And so in a very famous interview with Hansberry, she's referred to as a housewife that wrote a play. And Hansberry had, as I said before, been writing for numerous periodicals with her name as the byline for almost a decade before she wrote A Raisin in the Sun. And so while I do think it's important for us to use primary documents, I also think that it's helpful to understand those documents within the context of the world that Black women are operating in across US history, and particularly because they're often not seen as the protagonists of the stories, but as a supplemental character or a character off to the side. And so those are some of the questions and or issues that I have wrangled with in terms of methodology and form.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions in the chat, and I will let the people with questions in the chat rephrase their own questions. Heidi Feldman has a question about disorderly distribution and curation, I believe. Heidi, did you want to go ahead and ask your question and unmute? You're muted, Heidi.
Thank you. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'll just read the question. Thank you so much. This is a fascinating panel and such a perfectly kind of coordinated group of panelists. Your stories jive and resonate so well together. And so I wrote, it's really interesting to compare what Ashley's calling disorderly distribution of an archive with Soyika's navigation of curation by the Family Trust and Elia's position of greater maybe archival access as part of the family. And so I wanted to ask Ashley whether you sometimes feel like the challenge of the scattering of the archive can potentially free the biographer from some of the constraints of archival curation, because archives prioritize what part of an individual story are important within the context of the archives narrative, which is shaped by interests which could be national or racialized or gender or family or institutional. So I'm asking whether a writer could maybe gain a broader perspective of the subject's life by following those disorderly breadcrumbs to different archival sources that might give a fuller narrative of the subject's life.
I'm so glad you asked this. I actually have an article coming out about this fall with exactly this actually about the promise, I think, of disorderly distribution. And I think it has a couple, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think at first I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I've got 100 years of life and nothing to put together. But I realized that it was actually freeing in a couple of ways. It allows me to get outside of very rigid organizational accounts. Moore was a member of the UNIA, which was a huge organization, the Communist Party. So when someone is of that, but not, their archive isn't organized in that way, right? You really start to see the more individual story of that within a kind of an organizational framework. I started to be able to archive differently. When you can't look in the usual places, you kind of throw caution to the wind. And it has brought out just some really great finds. Like Queen Mother Moore wrote a lot of poetry. It's awful poetry, y'all, but it's poetry nonetheless. Just really bad. It's never labeled Queen Mother Moore poetry, right, in the archive, but instead just scattered in other folders that have to do with the protest, for example, that she was writing about, right? I don't know that I would ever have found these things if it were kind of neatly ordered. And I don't know if somebody were neatly ordering it in an archive, if that would ever make it in because of that. I also think for people like Moore, who live their lives under the weight of government surveillance. We talk a lot about dissembling because of, issues about personal life or sexuality, but something that is specific for people like everybody we're talking about here, but also Moore, was that the FBI followed her for the better part of 60 years, right? These FBI files of Hansberry and other folks are voluminous. And that offered a level of surveillance that didn't allow for them to have private lives. So I also think there's a little bit of, I don't want to say dignity, but of secrecy allowed and not assembling a life in that way. And I do think that is valuable, not only for what's left out, that maybe just needs to be left out, period, but also for being able to find these breadcrumbs in a different way that isn't also ordered not only by the surveillance of the archive, which we know is also kind of is a tool that is used for surveillance of Black people, but also the surveillance of the state.
Thank you, Ashley. And before we move to the next question, I want to invite Elia and Soyika, if you have anything to say about this particular question, the breadcrumbs and the disorderly archive, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I will just say that while I do have all of these documents, which now have been digitized, so they are available to whoever wants to go to the Indiana Historical Society website. So it's not just me having them. Though I do have some things that, there are family things that have been saved, but all of that I'm donating to the Schlesinger Library when I'm finished with this book. So they will be available to people. And I'm really happy. One of the things I did in writing On Her Own Ground was to do compulsively intense endnotes to put those breadcrumbs for other people. And there are some books that have been written subsequently where I can see that made a difference. And I was really intentionally trying to make it easier for the next person. I'm particularly proud that Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who's a professor of philanthropy at Indiana University, wrote a book on Madam Walker's philanthropy and just got a $300,000 prize. So I feel like I did do something good by putting the material out there. But, even with these letters, I still had a lot of disorderly distribution. of information, because it was before the internet when I was doing this. It was going to, a dozen different cities, going through the records in the courthouse in Delta, Louisiana, which fortunately hadn't been destroyed. Somehow the person during the Civil War, the Confederates had buried the ledger books, so they still existed, unlike other places. So I had, finding city directories, those kinds of things. So I think no matter who you're doing, even if there are, these amazing papers and archival materials, that you still do have to go to unexpected places.
Thank you so much. So did you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that the two previous comments made me think of a funny conundrum that I faced in the archive. And so when I was writing about Hansberry's speech during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in her documenting the speech, she had one date and location for the speech. In the FBI surveillance of her, they had another date and location. And then in Robert Nimroff's foreword to the published version of the speech, which was published after her death, there was yet another date. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what date I would use. And ultimately, I detailed that, questioning in the footnotes of the book, because to, the previous comment, I did know that I was writing about parts of Hansberry's work that had yet to be engaged. And so I wanted future scholars to know where I was entering into the conversation. And so there are copious notes in my book as well for the same reasons. And so I just say all that to say that even with archives, I think Hansberry's is pretty well curated. There are still, these ways that information or the facts can be complicated to understand. And I would be curious, although I know we're short on time, but perhaps at a later time, how others have navigated dealing with archives that have these surveillance records like FBI files.
And maybe if we have some time, we'll come back to that. Unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes, and I want to get to at least one of the remaining 2 questions in the chat. James Morris has asked a question that I think might be on a number of people's minds, and that I've already alluded to, of course, by alluding to Splut's book. And the question, I'll just read it, James, if that's okay. Do you think that the growing concern as to who has the right to tell someone else's story, particularly biographies of someone of a different gender or race than the writer, has changed? Who gets to write biographies of Black women? And, we might even expand that question to say, not just who gets to write them, but then who gets to, translate them into other media. I'm thinking here of the Netflix issue, right? Which books done by who seem to get the most kinds of promotion and distribution. This can also be a question, I think, not just of production, James, but of reception and uptake and marketing and distribution and movie rights and so on. So I will invite the panelists to speak to this question in any number of those directions if they would like to, starting with Ashley, if you'd like to speak to this.
I think I should cede my time to Lilia.
Okay.
Because she has the most to say about
Lilia?
I will try not to go on and on, but James, thank you. And I just want a shout out to James for all the work he did to get the organization where it is now. So applause for him. Who gets to tell the story? I think that it is, each case is different. People who really feel an affinity for the writer, for the person they're writing about, I just don't think I would not close that door. That just if you're not the same race or gender or whatever, that you can't write about somebody. So that would not be my personal position. On who gets to tell the story, and specifically on whether it's not a documentary, but it's a Netflix series. And so the first thing I say is Octavia Spencer was great, but the story is really, 95% inaccurate when you get to the details of it. And those of us who are steeped in history and steeped in fact, can be a little bit cranky about things like that. But I think my position, and when I see, friends like Erica Dunbar and other historians who are consultants now, that it is important, especially when these stories are being told for the first time, because Hollywood has ignored the stories, and Hollywood doesn't have a great track record on portraying people of color. But when these famous people their stories are told for the first time, I do think that it is important, even with creative license, to not turn the actual core values of the person on its head. And so I think that sometimes in the interest of Hollywood tropes and moving a story along and having conflict, that's what happens. And I will just say that in the case of Self-Made, when I was talking with the head writer, and the head writer said to me she wanted to focus on the conflict between Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone, in our first meeting, I said, that's an interesting part of the story. I wouldn't make it the centerpiece. And because I said that, she wanted to make sure that I did not have further conversations. And so for me, it became this cat fight between two women. And I was hoping for Hidden Figures. And I feel like I got Real Housewives of Atlanta. So believe me, as the next project that I'm working on already, I am working closely with the writer.
Thank you so much. And we've only got 60 seconds left. We have some other wonderful questions in the chat, and I apologize that we can't get to them, particularly because one of them is from Gretchen. So Gretchen, I'm sorry. But Sayika, did you want a last word on this question of sort of authenticity and authority? Those aren't James's words. Those are the words I would use for this sort of larger question.
I would agree that, there shouldn't be barriers to who could write about what subject matter. But I do think that we all need to have, a rigorous investigation of the work and be cognizant of the context that the figures we're writing about were living in and through as we're endeavoring to tell their stories. And so having a sensitivity to those dynamics, I think is important no matter where you're positioned in relationship to the subject.
Thank you so much. And we are exactly out of time. I just want to close by once again thanking the three panelists for their participation and working with me on this panel. And I want to thank Bio for giving us the hour. And it's a conversation that obviously needs much more time, and hopefully next year we'll be able to continue over drinks and in hallways and in person. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you
So much, everyone.